As you guys have noticed, the past few videos have been unboxings. Well, I haven't received the return label yet to send that gear back, so I'm going to use it to do a full Fortinet stack video for you. I'm going to go ahead and apologize ahead of time in the event that this video comes off salesy. It's specifically going to target running a full Fortinet stack in your environment. And when I say that, it means, the meat and potatoes of a typical network deployment. So you're talking about your firewall, your switch, and your access points. We have a FortiGate 60F, which would be our perimeter firewall in this environment. We have a FortiSwitch 108E PoE, which would be our distribution or access switch in this particular deployment. And then we have the FortiAP 231F. You remember that gear because that's what we recently unboxed on the channel. Since it's still here in the office, I figured I'd put it to use and show you guys how to deploy a full-fledged Fortinet stack top to bottom. Now before we dive in, this video is going to talk up about the Fortinet security fabric and how having that single pane of glass to actually manage everything from a central point is a good thing. At the time of this video, and in my personal opinion, there's only 3 or 4 companies that actually do this well. Fortinet with their Fortinet security fabric and being able to manage everything from the gate or from the manager. You have Meraki, who does a phenomenal job as well with their switches, access points, and firewalls. I hate their firewalls, but they get the ecosystem thing pretty down pat. And then of course you have Unify or Ubiquity that do a very good job of it as well. Those are the 3 that you usually look at if you're wanting to do a single deployment that has the same hardware manufacturer throughout the entire ecosystem. Now, we're going to go mobile. This is where things get fun. So, as you see here, I have the FortiAP 231F, the FortiSwitch 108E PoE, and then the FortiGate. Now, I'm going to flip this around so that you guys see it from my point of view. The AP is easy. It has 3 ports, one for a console and then 2 1 gig ports. One of the 1 gig ports is specifically for PoE. I take that cable and I run it into my FortiSwitch. Now none of these have any configuration on them yet, so that's just something to be cognizant of. I like to plug my APs into the first few ports. Now on this particular switch, it has to be port 1 through 4 anyways, because those are the only ones that are actually providing PoE. Now, everyone's a little OCD on how they deploy their networks. Me specifically, I like to use the last port of the switch as its uplink port. That means on the 8 port FortiSwitch, it's either going to be port 8, 9, or 10, depending on what type of connectivity I have available to me. If I had a FortiGate that could support fiber, I would have used these 2 at the end. What that also means is that if this was a 24 port switch, I would have used port 24. If it was a 48 port switch, I would have used port 48. It's just how I do things. The last few ports tend to be my uplink. Now, this is a FortiGate 60F, so I'm using the built-in FortiLink port for my actual uplink port here. The 60F has a port A and a port B hardware switch. It works out very well, and that's what I like to use it for. Please be aware though, obviously, if you're running anything that has hardware switch capabilities and you had more switches you wanted to connect directly to the gate, it's perfectly possible to remove ports from the internal hardware switch, add them to your FortiLink switch, and be on your way. Depending on the way you're deploying this, if it's a larger environment with a lot of switches, plugging directly into the FortiGate multiple switches usually isn't recommended. You kind of want to chain them together. Newer versions of code have made it work better, but Fortinet for some reason still has it on their topology guide to kind of limit using a hardware switch for multiple switch connections. So, now that I've shown you the actual physical connectivity, and you've seen enough of my ugly face, I'm going to switch to my computer screen. That way you can actually see the configuration process from the GUI perspective, as well as hear various nuances that I would prefer to do when I configure my environments. So I showed you how I like to actually physically connect my infrastructure whenever it's a smaller office setup. AP to switch, the last port of the switch up to the FortiLink port on the FortiGate. But that's only the physical side of things, and that's also for a very simple deployment. If you have a more advanced deployment where you're running HA, or if you're running different tiers of switches. Maybe you have distribution switches and then access switches underneath. We'll have to do some videos specific to those because you can get a little bit crazy on the cabling. You can overdo it, you can underdo it, but if you want full mesh, we'll cover that later. But for a simple deployment, where it's usually a small office or home office or maybe even one of the medium ones, if they have a single FortiGate, a single switch, and a single AP, the way we cabled it up at the beginning is how you would do it. So remember, we're running the FortiGate 60F. It's going to be our very top edge perimeter firewall. We have a FortiSwitch 108E PoE for our access switch, and then we have a FortiAP 231F hanging off that access switch for wireless connectivity and things of that nature. Before we jump in, a lot of people ask, why don't you just do the Forti Wi-Fi unit? Well, while I love the Forti Wi-Fi units, they're very, very powerful. They do a very good job on the things that they do. I'm very, very picky and OCD with how I set things up. Very seldom is the demarc location for your internet access dead center of the building. So Forti Wi-Fi might not be your best situation there, right? I like to deploy separate APs for a couple of reasons. One, if a new Wi-Fi standard comes out, I don't necessarily have to replace my edge firewall. Two, I'm able to put the AP exactly where it needs to be. I'm not limited based on where the internet connection comes into the building. And three, it just gives me more flexibility in general. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to my screen share here. So let's jump on over. So this is the FortiGate 60F. This is your standard run-of-the-mill 60F running 646. We can, running it 7.0 is the same exact way. Very little has changed with the way FortiLink is actually functioning. So you have a FortiGate running 646, which is highly recommended. And the way we connected it, if you recall, the last port of our FortiSwitch is going to port A of the FortiLink hardware switch. Now, these VLANs come out of the box once the switch is discovered, and they're used for various things. I very seldom use these. I like to create my own. It's just me being who I am. But you're more than welcome to use these for video, voice, and etc. Especially if you're using the onboarding section for like Fortinet and things like that. But as you recall, port 8 of our FortiSwitch goes to port A of our FortiLink interface. The FortiLink interface is used for the actual management of the device. FortiLink is nothing fancy. It's pretty much a protocol that rides on top of standard VLAN trunking. So it's not like they reinvented the wheel here. It's just a cap-wap tunnel that lets you actually manage the switch. So if you look at the FortiLink interface, you'll see a couple of things here. Automatically authorized devices. Now, for security best practices, you want that unchecked. But security best practices also varies from institution to institution, organization to organization, business to business. If you don't have any high-level compliance requirements like HIPAA, PCI, etc., there's no reason why you couldn't just automatically accept this. But for now, we'll leave it off. As you can see, FortiLink uses an unroutable APIPA-style address scheme for the actual addressing of the switches. I need to be very, very clear on this one. If you ever want to do remote SNMP monitoring of your switches, you need to put some thought in how you address your switch management scheme. You will want routable IPs there, especially if you have a hub and spoke type deployment where you have multiple branches going to a data center and the monitoring agent happens to be at the data center. It makes it easier. You may as well work it into your IP scheme. It just is what it is. Everything out of the box, this is exactly how it comes configured. The 60F has 2 ports, automatically throws them in these IP ranges, and of course, for security purposes, it has automatically authorizing devices turned off. Now, if you noticed on the dashboard, the security fabric already sees the 2 devices. It knows that there's a switch there, and it knows that there's a FortiAP hanging off that switch. Now, you won't see a 231F unless you're running 6.2 code or newer, so just be aware of that if you're running this switch. So what we'll do is our FortiGate, you know, this is a brand new inbox FortiGate. We're not doing anything fancy with it. First things first, we need to authorize the switch. So we go to Wi-Fi switch controller, manage FortiSwitch. Well, here's our 8 port. Let's go ahead and authorize, little buddy. When you authorize a FortiSwitch, a couple of things happen. The switch was discovered, meaning that using LLDP, the FortiGate's aware that the switch is downstream, the switch is aware that the FortiGate's upstream. But until you actually tell the FortiGate to manage the device, if the FortiSwitch was new in box, it's in standalone mode, meaning it'll stay that way until you actually authorize it and tell it to go about its business. Now, once you authorize it to be managed by the FortiGate, the switch will reboot in FortiLink mode, or FortiLink management mode, if you will, come back online, and you'll be able to see the ports and the activity through the FortiGate itself. The APs do the same process. They come on board, they pull an IP from whatever DHCP server is issuing. They'll check into an interface that has CapWAP or Security Fabric enabled, depending on the version of code. It's called CapWAP in 6.0 or earlier, so like 5.4, 5.6, 6.0, etc. 6.2 and newer, they call it Security Fabric or Fabric Device. So while this little buddy is rebooting, which it is an 8 port, the 108Es are a little bit slower on boot. So while this guy is coming on board, I'm going to come into the FortiSwitch VLANs and I'm going to configure the VLANs by my standard. That way I can go ahead and configure the switch to use it properly. So I'll go to create new. Now I have a very specific standard I like to use. I like to call VLAN 10 my voice VLAN. And I like to do 10.10. The second octet is specifically for the VLAN identifier, .1.1/24. And the third octet is specifically for site location identifier. I will actually do a video explaining why I IP things the way that I do, mainly because if you have big deployments that have large scale branch counts, I think you guys will come in handy with it. So I'm going to enable Security Fabric connection on this interface. I'm also going to enable HTTP, SSH, and ping. I'm going to let it dish out IPs based on how it is. Now this device is behind my FortiGate. So this is just for, like, you know, basic setup means. And this is going to be my default VLAN on all the ports of the FortiSwitch. So I click OK. So VLAN 10 is set up. Now I'm going to create my voice VLAN for any voice products that happen to live behind this. Now remember, the FortiSwitch comes with a voice VLAN out the gate. I don't use that. I am just picky. I like to do things my way. And then of course I'll create a new one for guest. These are the 3 most used VLANs in an environment that Mikey has deployed. So very basic setups: 10, 20, and 30. 10 for data, 20 for voice, and 30 for guest. Now let's jump back over here. Let's see if our switch is online, and it is. So one of the first things I recommend doing whenever you're dealing with a FortiSwitch and a FortiGate, especially in 6.4, is stepping the switch up to the latest version of code available to it. The reason being, if you're running 6.4.2 or 6.4.3 and your switches are running 6.2 code, there are bugs that may or may not brick the FortiSwitch, and I actually found this out the hard way. I put several gates up to 6.4 code while the switches were still lagging behind a little bit. And Fortinet has a very good matrix that tells you exactly what's compatible, what may be compatible, and what absolutely isn't. And after upgrading 150 sites, 30 of them had switches that just would not come online. The switch code is getting more and more stable, more and more robust, and less buggy with later versions. I wouldn't recommend going to 7.0 yet, but if you're running 6.4.7 on your FortiSwitch, you're not going to have any problems. So this buddy needs to be upgraded. And of course, they already have 7.0.1 available for the switch. I recommend going to 6.4.6 or 6.4.7. Now, since this switch does not have that currently, I'm going to leave it where it is for the sake of this video. The Fortinet firmware site is down for some reason right now anyways. So we have our FortiGate, we have our FortiSwitch. Now what we need to do is actually configure the ports on the switch. Out of the box, the switch is going to have this virtual switch FortiLink native VLAN and the QTN FortiLink allowed VLAN. You need to look at this like any other switch manufacturer. The native VLAN is the VLAN where all untagged traffic will live. So if you are used to HP switches or Cisco switches, you might consider it an, access VLAN XYZ, allowed VLANs ABC. The native VLANs where all untagged traffic goes. The allowed VLANs are the tagged VLANs that will be allowed to traverse this port. So for instance, we're going to run the data VLAN on all of our ports. That's going to be our native VLAN. If it doesn't tag, it needs to go on the native VLAN. But we're going to allow guest and voice on all of our ports. So if we have a phone and LLDP puts it on the voice network, it'll automatically tag for VLAN 20. Our guest Wi-Fi will automatically tag VLAN 30, putting them on the guest network. In order for the traffic to pass, you have to have the VLAN allowed. The only difference is if you're running tunnel mode SSIDs, obviously they can live wherever because they're using CapWAP to get back to home base. So I'm going to go ahead and select these guys and tell it to do data as the native, and I want to allow guest and voice. Something to remember, we are not using any advanced feature sets yet. We're not doing FortiNAC, we're not using 802.1x, we're not using quarantining or anything like that. That's more involved from a configuration standpoint and a little bit more advanced environment. We have everything configured. Our FortiAP is here. We're waiting on it to get an IP. But if we come up here, we can see that it's already waiting for authorization. Now, just like on the FortiLink interface, you can tell whatever interface you configure that listens for fabric devices to auto-authorize. It's connected via our data VLAN, which is exactly what we want. So we're going to right-click little buddy and go ahead and authorize it, which is going to cause the AP to do the same exact thing the FortiSwitch did, which is reboot, go through its jam, and do all of its things. So if we come back up here, we see the FortiGate, then we see that the switch is downstream, and we'll see the AP come online very shortly after. We've already configured our FortiSwitch to have the VLANs that are of interest to us. Our data VLAN for our regular wired users and our work Wi-Fi users. Our guest for our guest Wi-Fi, and then our voice for voice. Now, something that most people aren't aware of is that you can actually configure LLDP. So we're going to switch these guys over to use the default LLDP. Now what link layer discovery protocol does is that gives you the ability to automatically tag devices based on where they're from. And in this version of code, we cannot actually configure LLDP in the GUI. So config, switch manage LLDP profile, edit default, which is the profile that we wish to edit. If you do a git, you can see inventory management, network policy management. This is what's interesting to us. We want to automatically tag our voice networks to go to the voice, or our voice devices to go to the voice network. So we'll config med network policy, edit voice, get set status enable, which basically says we wish for this policy to be enabled. Once you do that, you can set the VLAN interface to be voice. And that's pretty much it. We can set a DSCP for 46. That'll make it a little bit more high priority on switching, but for the sake of this, we can leave it alone. Now, one thing to be cognizant of is auto ISL. If you are not using port 8 or whatever on your FortiSwitch for the uplink, and you're trying to use a downstream switch that has the default profile assigned to it, it's not going to automatically build a link between FortiSwitches. You'll want to use default ISL or default auto ISL, which makes things a little bit cleaner there. So Our Fortinet switch is configured with our native VLAN and our allowed VLANs. Our AP is coming online, so we'll jump over here, make sure it's up, and it is. Now we just need to create SSIDs. Create SSID, we'll call this one work. It'll be a bridge one because we're using VLANs here. We're not going to use tunnel mode. You can, but if I have a Fortinet switch and I have that visibility, I like to just merge everything. I don't want to use hardware switches or software switches to make an SSID come in and function a certain way. So we'll call this work Wi-Fi. And we can leave the optional VLAN tag to 0 because it's going to bridge it down to the it'll bridge it down to the native VLAN. So we'll just call this work Wi-Fi password and OK. Now we'll create our guest Wi-Fi. We'll bridge that as well. We'll call it guest Wi-Fi. Some random password goes here. Now for this one, we will actually tag the optional VLAN ID because if they're connecting to this SSID, we want them to tag VLAN 30, which is our guest Wi-Fi. And click OK. Now we'll come over here to our AP. Now we have to actually tell it to show the bridge ones. We're good to go there. Now, this AP connects to port 1 of our switch. It's sitting here, it's doing its thing. It allows guest and voice on it. It defaults to native. So if I take my phone and I connect in here, let me put my phone on here. So I'm going to put my phone on the guest Wi-Fi. Password goes here, join. You will see that my device is now showing it's connected. The device name is Get Ready for My Sweetness. That is a Skittles commercial that was banned way back when. I highly recommend Googling it. But you can see, all the details of the security stack. It's beautiful. So my device is on there and it's tagged to VLAN 30 because that's what the guest SSID is tagging to. If you're running a Meraki environment or if you're running a Fortinet environment and you're doing the full stack, top to bottom, the amount of power that you have at your fingertips from managing your network, knowing exactly where things are, it's really pretty impressive. So if we come down here to the security fabric and we look at the physical topology, the more Fortinet devices you have on the environment, obviously the more accurate this is going to be. It does take a little second for it to do its discovery. But as you can see, my FortiGate is the fabric route. It goes down to my Forti switch that then has my AP. So you're sitting here, you're able to tell exactly what you need to know. You need to know what ports or certain devices hanging off of. Well, port 1 of the switch has the AP. And I'm also able to see that Get Ready for My Sweetness, which is my phone, is connected. And my Apple Watch is as well. Now, if you speak Spanish, you know what that means. I'm not going to repeat it. I have a vulgar mouth, and it just is what it is. So you have full visibility into what's where. It can help you find culprits. It can help you dig down. And that's pretty much all you have to do. The only thing that's really left is configuring your internet connection as you intend it to be, whether you want it to be SD-WAN, whether you want it to just be an outside zone or something like that, and then configure your firewall policies to allow the traffic you wish to traverse. Every VLAN on a Forti switch is a separate interface, so you'll have to build policy to allow them to crosstalk. You'll have to build policy to allow them to go out, unless you start using zones and you group them together and you allow intra-zone communication or things like that. Like I said, and it's a little bit of a broken record on this, but if you want a full ecosystem that lets you see just exactly what's going on in your environment, Fortinet, Meraki, and Ubiquiti do a very, very good job of it. Now, this is just a basic Fortinet stack as well. We haven't even brought FortiClient into the mix. We haven't brought FortiNAC. FortiClient's actually able to report back to FortiAuthenticator using its single sign-on mobility agent. It's able to pull down firewall policies to the endpoint so the traffic won't even get to the FortiGate because the FortiClient can block it. This doesn't take into consideration that if you're running something like FortiEDR, you can actually have a core collector on your network that updates your firewall and blocks malicious threats that EDR finds. So their capability of actually tying everything together and making it sexy and functional and intuitive is coming a long ways. Now, back in 5.4 when FortiSwitches were relatively new and I had most of my environments connected via Cisco switch, I probably would have poo-pooed all over a FortiSwitch and said don't do it. But it's getting to the point where if you're running a full stack and you pay attention to the compatibility matrices that Fortinet gives you, and you make sure that your switches and your AP stay current so that when you do update your FortiGate, you don't nuke yourself like I did, you're going to be in a position to where it actually makes sense to spend the money to get the visibility. Now, obviously, it's a business decision. Not all businesses need to know exactly what port something is on, but if you're a managed service provider and you want to work more effectively and be able to resolve issues for your clients faster, especially if you're doing a fixed firm price deployment, which is how my companies normally do it, it just makes sense to be fast and efficient, right? So hopefully this video provided you with some insight on how to create a full Fortinet stack environment that makes sense to you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post them in the comments below. If this is your first time ever seeing one of my videos, do me a favor. Hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. Subscribe button lets you know when more videos come out. I try to push a new video out every Monday. Sometimes it's not as frequent, but that's the goal. If you didn't like something, hit the thumbs down. Let me know in the comments. This is a very organic channel. I make videos based on your recommendations. It is what it is. I can't come up with every single use case, but I can at least report back some of the ones that I come across. So, until next time, today is actually Father's Day, so hopefully you're having a good Father's Day or you had a good Father's Day. This video will go live tomorrow, Monday, June 21st. So hopefully you have a wonderful day, and if you need anything, post in the comments below and I'll try to respond. Thank you.